Amanda, welcome to the program. I know your book, High Conflict, Why We Get Trapped and How to Get Out, came out a couple of years ago. As usual, I'm late to the party and just discovered your book within the last 6 months or so. And I got to tell you, I'm so glad I did. I really enjoyed the book and referred back to it. I've written a couple of editorials myself that mentioned concepts that I learned in your book. So thanks for the book. Thanks for being on the program.
Thank you, Warren. I appreciate that. I'm really glad to hear from you.
Since I know we're not going to be able to cover everything in your book in the short amount of time we've got, I want to mostly focus our time today on a couple of key concepts and some of the sort of more significant or important stories in the book. Or when I say important, I mean meaningful to me, and I think meaningful to the overall narrative of the book. And one of the things that I would like to phrases that I'd like to start with and ask for your definition is this phrase, conflict entrepreneur. I think you coined that phrase. You can tell me whether you borrowed it from somebody else or not, but as far as I'm concerned, I'm willing to give you credit for that. And I've seen it everywhere, and I've used it a lot in the last 6 months since I learned of it.
It is a very sticky term. I've noticed that. You never know when you write a book, right, what people are going to really resonate with. But I would say that's probably the thing that I've heard repeated back most often, and the thing I get asked about the most. It is not an original term that I made up. It is a term that comes from violent conflict zones and the study of conflict zones. And so conflict entrepreneurs are people who exploit and inflame conflict for their own ends, sometimes for profit, like war profiteering, right? But more often, and this is where I have sort of adapted it to our context. I think in a highly polarized country like we've got, conflict entrepreneurs are taking different shapes than they would in a full-out violent war, right? But they are exploiting and inflaming conflict, and this is not just people, but companies, and they are doing it not just for profit, right? I sometimes think that's the least of it, although that's important, but it's also for a sense of importance, a sense of mattering, attention, a sense that you belong. Those things are just as powerful as money. And we've unfortunately set up a bunch of our institutions to really, celebrate conflict entrepreneurs right now. So, the challenge is for me to wake up every day and not be one. I think that's the temptation, is to play into that game because it's so richly rewarded right now.
Well, and I know you didn't write just a how-to book, but you actually do have some advice in the end of the book, or the last half of the book, on how to avoid being a conflict entrepreneur and how to de-escalate high conflict, as you describe it in the book. And I want to get to that, but I want to table that conversation for a moment, or that part of our conversation, and talk about another couple of ideas and individual stories. Amanda, we at Ministry Watch, we write about Christian ministries. We do financial analysis and investigative journalism related to Christian ministries. And we've had no shortage of things to write about over the last few years, I'm sad to say. But one of the things that we've also discovered is that there have been no shortage of conflict entrepreneurs who have entered this space that are approaching this not necessarily as a journalistic enterprise, but they've discovered that there is profit in these sensational headlines and these salacious stories. And yet one of the stories that you talk about in your book that was particularly instructive to me, given the reality that I live in every day, was the story of Glenn Beck. And do you mind sharing that story, how he kind of had an evolution and discovered that the world he had created made it almost impossible for him to evolve in positive ways?
Yeah, and he's not alone, right? But I think he's a really public example of someone who, I think even he would agree that he was a quintessential conflict entrepreneur, right? For many, many years. He spent like a decade aggressively promoting conflict on Fox News, CNN, his own TV network. And he did all the things that conflict entrepreneurs do. He trafficked in, extreme analogies and conspiracy theories that gave his audience a sense of real righteous moral clarity, which is what we all want. We all want clarity, especially in a time of anxiety. So there is a natural need for more clarity. Who is good? Who is evil? And he supplied that. And in his first, I think the first 14 months he was on Fox News, he and his guests alluded to Hitler 115 times, Nazis 134 times, fascism 172 times. Usually people who are in this role will reach for Nazi allusions, right? They're not the only ones who will, but it is something that I've seen again and again. And he knew how to exploit the fear of his audience. And so he did this for a long time, and it was very, quote unquote, successful for him by some metrics. And then he started acting differently. And around 2014, he started voicing regret on the record interviews, revealing a kind of internal conflict and ambiguity that he hadn't shown us much before. And he actually said, I wish I could go back and be more uniting in my language. He said that on national TV. He said, I played a role, unfortunately, in helping tear the country apart, and it's not who we are. So like a lot of people who are conflict entrepreneurs, he went through a difficult moment where he started to question it. And I admire him for that. He really publicly questioned it. And it's a very lonely, scary thing to do when you've built your whole career.
Well, let me interrupt your story here just for a minute, Amanda, to say a couple of things about that. Number one is that I hope that people listening to us are not hearing this as a critique of Glenn Beck per se. That what I found interesting about that story was that he had a position. He came to question whatever that position was. And then he came to question that position and to really ask hard questions about his own position. He would do what, as a reporter, I recommend young reporters to do, which is to report against your bias, to ask devil's advocate questions of your own position to see if it provides any insight. And like you said, you admire, at least I do, I admire a person for willing to do that. But then what happened next?
Well, he did this for a couple of years. He went on different shows that you wouldn't expect him to be on. Krista Tippett's podcast On Being, some of your listeners may know. He went on Samantha Bee, people who tend to have pretty left of center audiences. And again, he took ownership for helping to divide the country. And he said to Samantha Bee, my message to you is, please don't make the mistakes that I made. I think all of us are doing it. And he really made an open call to try to stop this cycle, this vicious cycle that we're in of high conflict. But then from what we could tell, now I reached out to him many times. I'd still love to talk to him. I got close to interviewing him, but then he apparently decided not to sit for an interview for reasons I don't know, but I could imagine. And at some point, it seemed like his public rhetoric shifted back. And this was during a period of stress. He had to lay off about 20% of his employees because he had opposed, at this time during the first term of Donald Trump, he had opposed Trump as a candidate, and that had cost him a lot of viewers, right? And so here he is kind of trapped in his old persona, right? That is where he finds value and in the world, that's his identity. And when he tries to shift, people don't like it. People around you don't like it if they're used to that. And that, we could probably all relate to that, right? Like if you went through a period of your life where you were a big drinker and now you're not, you'll have friends who don't like that, right? Or you were super partisan and now you're not. You'll have friends who really, who want you to be the person you were. And so he had that, but at a massive scale. And so eventually in 2018, he put on his Make America Great Again hat on TV and announced he'd changed his mind. He's going to vote for Trump in 2020. Said some things that were very contrary to what he'd said before. And it seems like he kind of was vacillating, and still is, from what I can tell from the outside, right? There's a lot I don't know, but still kind of vacillating between these two roles of conflict entrepreneur and what we might call conflict interrupter, or someone who's tired of this dynamic.
Well, for me, one of the key lessons there is that when I was at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, we put out daily content, and so we had editorial team meetings about once a week. And a couple of things I'll mention there is that relative to that is that we would sometimes say in our editorial meetings, the first person to invoke the name of Hitler automatically loses the argument because it means that you have departed from a nuanced and specific critique of someone and are starting to either overreach or create a straw man. And it's and I see that a lot in in common discourse or in public discourse, as you said. Beck was doing that, and so the other piece of it, though, that I thought was interesting about this story is that he became a victim of his own he became a victim of the conflict that he himself had created. And I don't want to make this too much about politics, but I think about what Donald Trump is going through now with the Jeffrey Epstein controversy. In some ways, is maybe a more recent example of that, right? I mean, you had the MAGA right, including Donald Trump himself, creating this this myth about this conspiracy theory about Jeffrey Epstein whenever it turns out not to be true. And even Donald Trump himself acknowledges that it's not true. His own people are starting to turn on him. I'm wondering if you would have used that story in your book if you'd written your book 3 years later.
Yeah, especially if, and maybe this will happen, you never know. One thing I've learned is you cannot give up on people, even conflict entrepreneurs. But if Trump were now saying, you know what, I shouldn't have done that. I shouldn't have assumed there was something nefarious here before I knew. That would be one thing, right? That's kind of like what Glenn Beck did. I feel like there was more kind of, for a moment, openness to owning and some percentage of the problem and trying to redeem himself. Unfortunately, if you have those moments, and sometimes it's called a saturation point in conflict research, where you start to really question the conflict and your own part in it and want to get out, very often there's nowhere for you to go. So I have written for the Washington Post and other places about, we need to give these people an off-ramp. Tucker Carlson went through another form of this where you could see him really publicly questioning the conflict, and there's nowhere for him to go. Now, does that mean that he should be excused for some of the things he's done to help turn Americans on each other, and he continues to do it? No, it doesn't mean that. But you have to find off-ramps for people in conflict, including violent conflict, but also this kind of conflict, which, by the way, is violent in a lot of cases. So you have to let people, you have to hold the door open for people to change if they seem to be really committed to doing so, because otherwise they'll just go right back. I mean, you just can't live with that kind of ostracism. Most people can't do it. Some people can, most people can't.
Well, I think that's I think a lot of folks tend to, they don't hold that door open. They don't give them an off ramp. In other words, when too many of us encounter a Tucker Carlson or, for example, we disagree with them. We just want to vilify them. On the other hand, it's a lot of folks on the, would say the same thing of a Bernie Sanders or I don't know who would be a good example, but
yeah, like Representative Crockett in Texas. There's lots of people who on the left who inflame conflict. I mean, I think Rachel Maddow has done it. There's a lot of people who've made a career out of inflaming conflict on the left as well.
That's right, and so it is a good word. We need to remember that people do change, and B, that if and when they change, we need to be ready to let them get out of the washing machine, so to speak. The constant spin cycle that's going on. One of my heroes is a man named Chuck Colson, who was a Watergate conspirator.
Great example.
I knew Chuck for years, and before he passed away back in 2012, and Chuck is a good example of that. But one of the things that I will say about Chuck is that he had a religious conversion, and he really wanted to change. I mean, not only did religion play a really powerful role in his in his desire to change, but there was a there was that desire. I mean, I mean, of course, I believe as a Christian that what he experienced was something supernatural and a transformation. But one of the things that was transformed was his will. He did not want to be that person anymore. And a lot of people, I think sometimes don't really want to change. They just don't want to. They just don't want to get caught, and they don't want to see their platform disappear. So they behave however they think they are supposed to behave. I don't think that I've got a question in there, Amanda. I'm just sort of rambling.
Well, no, I'm glad you brought up Chuck Colson. I toured a prison with him once when I was working at Time Magazine, and I just, yeah, the whole time I'm wondering, like, is this for real? And it sounds like, I mean, you knew him much better, and it sounds like it was. Like, from what you could tell, it was for real. And that's a good example.
Let me just say, there's no question in my mind that it was real. I mean, Chuck was still a very hard charging guy, a very demanding person after his conversion. But there was also a gentleness and a sweetness about him. And he absolutely, repented of some of that, some of his earlier language and behavior, no question about that. But let me I've sort of gotten myself tied to knots here. Let me try to reclaim my thread and my narrative here just a bit, and because I wanted to ask you to talk about a couple of folks. Speaking of people that that could be redeemed and could be changed, you recount the story in your book of Curtis and Billy, stories, I guess I should say. They're intertwined stories. Can you quickly sort of recount that story for, the murder and the subsequent, change in heart that happened there? I'm purposefully being vague here because I want you to tell that story, Amanda.
Yeah, actually, it's funny. I was just talking to Curtis yesterday. Curtis remains the person I call when I am really struggling with how to help be of use in a time of really dysfunctional conflict and in all kinds of conflict. Today, he works on gang violence interruption for Chicago Cred on the south side of Chicago, doing incredible work. But to go back in time, as you said, so Curtis was a fairly high-ranking gang leader in Chicago for many years. And it all kind of started for him. He had joined a gang when he was only 9 years old, his first gang. And like most people who join gangs, he was looking for respect and protection and status and connection, a sense of belonging. And then when he was like 12 or 13, he ended up, I'm hearing an echo here. I don't want to mess up your recording, but do you hear it?
No, I do not.
Okay, hopefully we're okay. Okay, so when Curtis was 12 or 13, there was a neighborhood basketball hero. Actually, he was a hero for the whole of Chicago. And he was someone who, was nationally ranked. He could write his own ticket. He was in high school. He was being recruited from all the best universities. And Curtis believed that he was in his same gang. Probably not the case, but that's what Curtis believed as a kid. And one day, this basketball hero was shot and killed outside of his high school at lunchtime. And he was shot and killed by another teenager who Curtis vaguely knew from the neighborhood, who was part of a rival organization. And so from that point on, Curtis had a story in his head that this rival organization, the Gangster Disciples, had killed his hero. And he needed revenge. He couldn't live in a world where someone who had that much grace and power and potential could just be snuffed out like that for no reason, right? And so the narrative of the conflict actually gave him a sense of mission and purpose and drive. And this often happens, as we all probably can relate to this, right? When things are frightening, it is helpful to have an enemy and to have the world cleanly split into good and evil. And so that's what happened. He spent many years pursuing a vendetta against the Gangster Disciples. And, meanwhile, the person who had actually fired the shot was put in prison almost immediately for 20 years. And so he couldn't actually take revenge out on the actual shooter. But, what you often find is people, when they have a lot of internal pain, they'll take anyone they can get, right? They'll take it out on any kind of proxy for their real target. And so that's what he did for a very long time. Lots of things happened that are detailed in the book, but eventually, one day, he's working. Actually, he was going to Friday prayers. He's a Muslim, and so it turns out was the gentleman who had killed the basketball hero. So Billy Moore had started working in gang violence interruption as well once he came out of prison, and so Curtis sees him. And now, luckily, Curtis is in a very different place at this point in his life and has a lot of emotion regulation skills and a different view on the conflict and all the things that he worked very hard to develop. And so he comes up to Billy and he says to him, "Man, I've been looking for you for a very long time." And he says, "I wanted to kill you." And he's kind of smiling, and they shake hands, and Billy says, "Did you think I was just going to let you?" And they laugh. And then Billy says, "Can I tell you what actually happened?" And then they spend hours talking. And Billy tells him what actually happened, which is the kind of story you hear over and over and over again in this country, which is a story of two boys who feel publicly embarrassed. The basketball hero had shoved Billy, according to Billy's telling, out of the way. They didn't even know each other. And Billy felt disrespected on the sidewalk, and there were girls watching the whole thing, and he had a gun for another reason that he'd taken from a family member. And he took it out and demanded an apology, and he didn't get one, and he shot the gun. And it was, as he has said many times, the worst mistake of his life. He regretted it instantly. And this is the story that Curtis has heard 1,000 times from the young men and women he works with, right? And it was so painfully familiar. And it was not this elaborate conspiracy that he had thought. It was not a gang rivalry that explained everything. And so there's this moment, this sort of sinking realization that this narrative you've built your whole life on top of is not true. And I can't tell you how many people who've been in high conflict like Curtis have, if they manage to get to that realization, that sinking realization, and allow it, it's like this, transformative shift. I mean, I think it's very painful and difficult, but in Curtis's case, he was, by his own admission, a conflict entrepreneur for many years. And he shifted, he'd already started shifting, but he shifted out to be a conflict interrupter. But this moment was very important in helping him understand how bewitched he had become by the narrative, which I think is happening all the time, right? Like we are all subject to becoming in thrall to the narratives.
Well, I really like that language that you used, enthralled to the narrative, bewitched by the narrative, because that really does seem what's happened. In fact, you make the point in your book that at some point the source of the conflict becomes either forgotten or irrelevant, and that it's sustaining and perpetuating the conflict itself that becomes sort of the dominant activity, the dominant driving force in behavior. And one of the ways that you make this point was with a metaphor early in the book that I probably should have introduced the story with, but now that we're sort of nearing the end of our conversation, I can't resist asking you, completely out of place, to tell this story. And that's the story of the La Brea tar pits, because that again becomes sort of it really, in very vivid and visual terms, illustrates in some way some of the ideas that we've been talking about. Would you tell us that?
Yeah, and I think it's actually perfectly timed, because I think about this all the time, and I wonder why there isn't more news coverage of how it's the high conflict itself that's driving the behavior, right? It's not the facts, it's not strategy. And I see these books are coming out, right, about, and I'll come back to your question quickly, I promise, but about why did people protect Biden, and why did people insist that he had to run again, even though those closest to him could see that he was probably not in a good shape to run again. And all this speculation, right? But I think, to me, from everything I know, from all my reporting and all the research I've seen on conflict, the answer's fairly obvious. When you believe there is an existential threat on the other side, you will back anyone and you will stick with that decision come hell or high water. And I have seen this on the left and on the right. People who know better, who know that President Trump has done some very slimy things, they will stick with him because they are so afraid of and contemptuous of the other side, and vice versa. And that doesn't mean I think both sides are equal and blah, blah, blah. It just means both sides are human and both sides are at risk of the delusions that come with high conflict. So you will double down on bad decisions because the threat feels so existential. So let me finally answer your question.
Yeah, no, but that was helpful. That was great. Thank you.
This is the threat, right? So the La Brea Tar Pits, folks may have heard of this place, but it's right off Wilshire Boulevard in Los Angeles near an IHOP. It's an actual place you can go visit and tour. And it looks like a lake, like a small lake, but it's actually a natural asphalt pool that's been gurgling up from the ground since the last ice age. And scientists have found more than 3 million bones trapped in the depths of this thing, including the skeletons of mammoths, sloths, and more than 2,000 saber-toothed tigers. So just imagine, right? So it's a living quagmire. And tens of thousands of, the question is, how did all these animals get in here, right? Well, tens of thousands of years ago, the scientists believe a large mammal like a bison lumbered into the tar pits and got stuck. Right? It only takes a couple inches for a large mammal to get stuck in this sticky asphalt and starts grunting in distress, right? And then that sound attracts predators like the dire wolf at the time, who is like, great, I can get a bison who's just stuck here. And then the wolves go out, and of course they immediately get stuck, and then more creatures arrive, and eventually, very slowly, these animals die and their carcasses slowly sink out of sight. And 4,000 dire wolves have been pulled out of the La Brea Tar Pits, their bones. So look, this is kind of weird and spooky, but the point is, high conflict is a trap, just like the La Brea Tar Pits. It draws us in for very natural evolutionary reasons, just like those wolves. But then it's really hard to get out once you get in, and it gets more and more crowded every day. And so it's very tricky, and you have to deal with that kind of conflict really differently than you would deal with like everyday normal conflict, because it's so magnetic.
Well, I found that metaphor to be both, like as I said, both vivid and extremely helpful in explaining why people would continue to just sort of pour in like lemmings, over a cliff, why they would continue to pour in to these situations that are clearly bad for them. And yet, as we do that. Amanda, I need to pivot in our conversation in the very few minutes that we've got left, and maybe propose or allow you to propose a way out of high conflict. Let's just stipulate for the record, if you want to get the full story, go get the book, go read the book. It's enormously helpful, both in the prescription, or rather in the diagnosis and the prescription, and we only have a few minutes to spend on the prescription. But there are 2 or 3 concepts that I wanted you to talk about. One is what you describe as buying time. The other one you describe as complicating the narrative. And there's a whole lot more than just those 2, but I'd like to maybe just close our conversation with asking you what it means to buy time, and how does that get us out of high conflict situations?
Yeah, so everyone that I followed in the book who shifted out of high conflict into a healthier kind of conflict, which is the goal. The goal is not no conflict, right? Like, we need conflict. So everyone who made that shift, including Curtis, who we've talked about, they slowed down the conflict in some way. And there are different ways to do this, but it's a really important way to kind of step away from the pit. And one of the things that, since the book came out, I co-founded a company called Good Conflict with a fellow journalist. And we've trained, a couple thousand journalists, a couple thousand other people in how to resist that magnetism. And one of the most popular things that we train is something I learned from Gary Friedman, who's in the book, a conflict mediator, is a listening skill called looping, which is a way to slow down and de-escalate in the moment when you're in a conversation with any heat at all. But basically all it is you listen to what sounds like the most important thing to the other person who's talking. And then you you put it into your own words and play it back to them, and you check if you got it right. And you have to do it with genuine curiosity. So it takes some practice to do this under stress. But people can get much better at it really fast. And what you're doing in that case is slowing down that spiral and really trying to understand, what is this person telling me? And because there's a lot of mistakes we make. There's an old quote that the biggest mistake in communication is thinking it happened. And so one of the things I've learned is that we humans are much more confident about our ability to understand each other than we actually are able to understand each other. So looping and other skills like that are really helpful to slow down the conflict.
We'll talk a little bit about complicating the narrative, because one of the things that and we did not talk about Mark Limos, but he did I get his last name right? Limos.
Linus.
Linus. He had a black or white narrative in the issue of genetically modified crops. Curtis had a black and white narrative. Glenn Beck had a black and white narrative. And I think we should acknowledge, going in, that sometimes, some things are clearly wrong. Some things are clearly, absolutely preferred behaviors, right? And that there are moments where clarity and where black and white are called for. But one of the things that all three of these people and many others discovered is that once they understood more, once they had a more nuanced understanding of a particular situation, it really did change their perspective. And so you say that one of the ways to de-escalate high conflict is to complicate the narrative. First of all, do I have you right in that? And can you say more about it?
Yeah, so there's a place at Columbia University called the Difficult Conversations Lab, which is run by a professor named Peter Coleman and his colleagues. And Peter's written a couple of great books on intractable conflict. And they've recorded more than 500 conversations between strangers who disagree about some very controversial subject, abortion, guns, immigration, that kind of thing, and then studied how those conversations went. And one of the things they noticed is in a lot of those conversations, people kind of stayed stuck. They just experienced the same negative emotions over and over, and they emerged from the lab pretty unsatisfied. But in other conversations, people did experience frustration and those negative emotions, but then they also experienced like glimpses of surprise or understanding or even humor. And so it was like there was movement, and they experienced like a sort of whole range of emotions instead of just being stuck. And they asked each other more questions, and they emerged from the lab more satisfied because they had understood something they didn't understand before, even if they didn't change their minds. Anyway, the big finding that Peter Coleman and his colleagues figured out was that you could induce those better conversations by just having people read something before they went in the lab, briefly, something short. They had half their study participants go into the lab after reading a pretty straightforward traditional news story. You'll appreciate this, Warren, I think, which was like had, two sides to an issue, some other hot button issue, right? Like peace in the Middle East. And it would just had two sides. And you'd quote activists from both sides, kind of standard. And then they had another group read a story at the same length on the same subject that acknowledged that there were more than two sides, that there were some people feel this way, some people feel that way. And there's this other third group is not sure what to think. And that's actually more accurate because most people have complicated feelings about difficult social issues, right? And those people went into the lab and had those better conversations that were less stuck, and they emerged more satisfied. So this is a very big deal, I think, for journalism, but also for all of us, which is that you can prime people for curiosity with a little bit of complexity that's tied to reality. You're not complexifying something that is actually simple. You're revealing the complexity that is out there. And in a very brief period of time, you can kind of open people to considering things in other parts of their lives. So that is extremely encouraging, I think. And so that is where Complicating the Narratives, which is an essay I wrote about what journalists could learn from conflict mediators, that's where that headline came from.
Yeah, well, I think you're right. It is encouraging, and it's I have found your advice in this book to be very nourishing. A conversation for another day, probably, Amanda. But I must say that I'm nonetheless I wouldn't say in despair, but discouraged by our ability, I mean, as a culture,
Yeah.
to make some of these changes. Because while I can read your book and resolve, and maybe even to have some success at implementing my resolution to listen better, to do looping or listening checks, to to complicate the narrative and see if there's more to the story. I do worry that my efforts as an individual, or mine and your efforts as individuals, or even mine and your efforts and the 2,000 people that you've trained over the last couple of years as individuals,
Yeah.
are a kind of a weak soup against against the conflict entrepreneurs who control the levers of a very sophisticated and powerful machine. Am I
Totally.
right or wrong to be discouraged
You're
here?
totally right. I feel the same discouragement. We are outgunned, and it is frustrating. And it is most of all heartbreaking, right? To keep watching this happen and people feed the conflict, even when they say they want to get out of it. So it's very frustrating. Our kind of theory of change, which might be wrong, we don't know. But our hope at Good Conflict is if we can help, along with many other people who have more reach, if we can help Americans get more conflict literate and understand how we are being manipulated, which we are, then we are less vulnerable to manipulation. Because most Americans are not happy with this. Even most politicians. I mean, I work with members of Congress and their staff. They don't like this. It might seem like they do. They don't. 99% of them do not enjoy this level of conflict. They want to get the stuff done, right? They may not want to get stuff done that you and I want them to get done, but they do want to be good at their jobs. And this is a miserable way to live. Much like when you talk to gang members, most of them do not like it. They don't like being threatened. They don't like the hostility. So we have to help build an off-ramp, and it can't just be us, looping each other. You're right, totally. I just wrote an essay for Persuasion about how political officials have got to come together around some baseline norms of decency and how they talk about their opponents, particularly the public. And that is what has worked in other countries to reduce political violence. And that is what we should ask of our officials as well. And not all of them are going to come to the table, right? But some of them are. Some of them already have. The state of Georgia has a pretty impressive principles that, something like 70 politicians have signed on to for how to behave around an election, and thousands of people have signed on to it around the country. You and I could sign on to it as well, something that the Carter Center helped put together. So anyway, I do think that we got into this mess partly because journalism and politics modeled this behavior for us. And so part of how we get out is journalism and politics have to model something differently. It's not entirely going to be bottom up, but I do think there is hope because people are so sick and tired of it.
Right, right. Well, I hope your book will play a role in that, Amanda. I know it certainly has, just individually for me, so I'm grateful for it. So thanks so much for being on the program. I'm grateful, and yeah, have a conflict-free rest of the day.
Thank you, Warren. You too.